Howdy folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to be talking about the book of Genesis. Now, regardless of where you were born, or where you grew up, regardless of what language you speak, no matter how old you are, no matter what you believe, one could argue conclusively that the written work that we call Genesis is the most important and most influential written material ever produced by humans. What we call the book of Genesis, or just Genesis for short, could basically be summed up as the first of 5 scrolls that were written down sometime during an event called the Babylonian captivity in the 6th and 5th centuries BC. We'll be talking about Korush, or Cyrus the Great, as we know him in our soft, modern pronunciation of ancient names. These 5 scrolls are called the Torah. Also, in the Greco-Roman world, they were referred to as the Pentateuchoi. Pente is 5, and Teachos is a scroll in ancient Greek. And so, in modern English pronunciation, we just say Pentateuch. The Pentateuch. Pentauch. Not a very pleasant word, but that's ancient Greek for you. Don't know what to tell you. And speaking of unpleasant pronunciations of things, we know this book as Genesis because that's the French adapted pronunciation of the Greek word Genesis. And Genesis is just ancient Greek for birth or origin. It's the same Greek word that we get the word genetic from, or generations, or generator. It means to give birth to give rise to originate, to create. The beginning of things. And that's what we're talking about today. The original title was just the first few Hebrew words of the Hebrew original, and basically they call it the in the beginning. And that's because that's the meaning of the first few Hebrew words of the book, and those are pronounced Bereshit. Bereshit. So, not very pleasant. Sounds kind of like bury something unpleasant. But there it is. So, of course, I prefer ancient Greek, Genesis. Genesis sounds a lot cooler than Bereshit. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, okay, Vincent, all this talk about ancient Greek pronunciation has triggered me here, and it occurs to me that aren't you right smack in the middle of the revelation to John? Well, yeah, but just because this is another book in the Bible doesn't mean that they're even remotely all that related to each other. I mean, in the revelation of John, we have one person's experience that he wrote down in his own unique stream of consciousness voice in 95 AD. And it has a very specific and strange and dark tone and focus in terms of the topics that it covers. And Genesis is completely different. As you might expect, it's on the other side of the Bible. The Revelation to John is the very last book, and the last book to make it into the canon. Genesis, or Genesis, was the canon when it was written, and it was written by a variety of high-ranking people in the Jewish community at the time. And so there is an authoritative quality that the material in Genesis has that the revelation to John doesn't. Also, Genesis is vastly more influential over all of Western history that was to follow, more so than Revelation. And I think it's fitting because the Bible is a collection of works. It's not all one thing. It's a book with 40 different authors, as they say, written down over the course of several hundred years in terms of when it was literally written down, i.e., from as early as 600 BC in some of the outlier estimations, and then as recent as 120 AD, if you count some of the estimates for the final version of the Gospel according to John. However, of course, most people would place the Revelation as the definite last book to be written down in its final form and the last book to be added to the canon, especially. But bear in mind that some versions of the Gospel according to John are dated slightly later than the Revelation to John. And of course, all that complication we cover in the first volume of my series on the Revelation to John. But some of the Genesis stories, even though they may have been written down as recently as around 400 BC, they refer back to information and narratives that date back to the very beginning of the agricultural revolution, around 6,000 years ago. And so I also think, of course, it's just fun to jump from the ending of the Bible around the end of the 1st century AD back to the very beginning of the Bible, which was written down about 500 years earlier and refers to narratives that go back thousands of years to well before the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. Which basically, think of Moses. When you think of the Bronze Age collapse, think of Troy and Moses. Think of Odysseus trying to get back home, and think of the Israelites wandering in the desert. These are some of the biggest events, apparently, that were recorded in literature, referring to some of the political and social chaos that was going on during the Bronze Age collapse. So in other words, one way to sum all this up is to say that I'm approaching the Bible the same way that Quentin Tarantino might approach it, or even better yet, a Christopher Nolan film. Where we've got this cool flashback situation where we start with the very ending. We talk about the revelation to John and the end of the world and the early Christian church. And that's how they like to do it. They start at the ending, they get bogged down in a bunch of details, and then they try to refresh the narrative and keep the audience interested by jumping back to the beginning of the story. Basically, they're like, so you might be wondering how we got here. And then all of a sudden, we jump back to the beginning of time. And we have long discussions about why God decided to create light before he created the sun. And what does that mean? Yeah, that's the way I like to do things. So don't worry, we'll definitely be getting back to Revelation. I mean, after all, the beast is about to make his debut. I mean, we've got a biblical book that has dragons in it. I mean, come on. Of course we're going to go back to Revelation. But I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about Genesis and what the heck do these stories mean. So, unlike with the Revelation to John, we're not going to launch into an endless series of discussions of background information to give context to what we're about to hear. I don't think Genesis needs that kind of context. We don't know the authors the same way that we know a little bit about John the Elder. We know that Genesis was written by multiple authors who differed not only themselves by perhaps decades, but the stories that they were working with, the narratives that they were compiling, could have been received thousands of years apart. Meaning, one part of Genesis may be adapted from stories that were handed down from around 5000 BC. And then another editor would have been working with material that was from 800 BC, much more recent. So, Genesis is written during the classical period. I like to say somewhere around 500 BC. A lot of it was written after 500 BC, meaning in the 400s. A lot of it was written before then. It's a lot of guesswork and estimation involved at that point. But it's important to know that, well, and we'll talk about what Genesis meant to the people who were writing it down. And we'll talk about what was going on in the world of Judaism when Genesis was finally written down. And, of course, it involves a lot of complicated politics, in particular having to do with the Babylonian conquest of what was then Judea. The collapse of the freedom of the days of King Solomon and King David. And so Genesis, we'll find out, is a statement of identity. It's a statement of survival. It's a statement about who are we and where did we come from, and how are we different from the people around us. Even though they rule over us, we're still different. And here's why. Because we have a relationship to God, the one true God of the universe, that other people don't. So the way I like to think of Genesis is that even though it was written down right smack in the middle of the classical period, so even though Genesis is very much a product of its time in the classical period, I think of it as a dim, imperfect window into events that happened before the Bronze Age collapse. So there's some layering going on here. There is the top layer, which is our 500 BC Jewish authoritative author who is compiling documents that were written down from oral traditions that date back 1,000 years before they ever set their little stylus to their papyrus. Now, how reliable were these oral traditions? Should we pay any attention to this stuff? As we'll see, it's highly mythological. It's very colorful. The stories clearly are more interested in morality and philosophy and psychology rather than actual economics or physics or anything like that. These stories are about who humans really are and who God really is, and about why God made the universe the way he did, and about why we see the universe that we see around us. It's an explanation, and in particular, it's an explanation of suffering. Why do we suffer? Why is the world like this? Well, that's what Genesis seeks to answer. That's what Genesis wants to tell us. I feel weird taking a long time to introduce Genesis because it just doesn't need the same context build-up that Revelation did. So here's what I'm going to do. We're just going to listen to the first part, the first 2 days of creation in the creation myth. I mean, let's just go for it. The book means the beginning, the basis, the origin. Nothing came before this. This is it. So what else is there to talk about before the beginning of the universe? Nothing. There was just God and his plans. I also need to talk a little bit about how I made this stuff. First of all, what text did I use? I used the New Jerusalem Bible translation. This is not my translation of Genesis. I do not know Hebrew. I had one teacher who taught a course that was split between classics students and the seminary, and that teacher knew Koine, Greek, and then also Hebrew. So that was pretty impressive. But I do not know Hebrew. However, the New Jerusalem Bible, the translation that I'm using, is a well-respected version of the Bible. It's a scholarly translation that gets certain things right that other translations are a little wishy-washy about. And it is definitely on the approved list of Bibles for the Catholic Church and most other denominations. One cool little tidbit about the New Jerusalem Bible is that this guy named J.R.R. Tolkien was one of the translators. He was in the committee. And I swear, there are some passages where I have to stop and think, did he do that? Because Tolkien has a very distinctive style. However, one thing that makes his style so distinctive for modern readers is how much he borrows from ancient literature. He's an ancient literature guy. And so him translating the Bible just makes perfect sense. So to create the voices that you hear, I record myself reading the material, and then I feed it into an AI that changes my voice to another voice, but that virtual actor will copy my pace and intonation and that sort of thing. I have to be careful with my long vowels, or else everybody will start to sound like they're from Texas. Then, as for the sound effects, I go on the internet and I find little pieces of noises that fit here and there, and then I import them into Audacity and change all sorts of things about them and mix a bunch of sounds together in order to get the effect that I want. And then the music is the big part. I thought that, especially since we'll be listening to some of these passages more than once, it would be helpful to have some catchy music to make them a little more pleasant to get through. And there's an AI service that definitely delivers in that area. And I think it did too good of a job on the music, and so I hope it's not too distracting. So let's just listen. Then we'll talk about it. Then we'll listen to it again. And when we do that, if my calculations are correct, when we re-listen to it and you hear the little codes that I point out and you listen to it the right way, it will blow your fucking mind. But anyway, without further ado, here is the very beginning of Genesis, the beginning of the beginning, the book of Genesis. Let's listen.
In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now the earth was a formless void. There was darkness over the deep. With a divine wind sweeping over the waters, God said,
"Let there be light."
And there was light. God saw that light was good, and God divided light from the darkness. God called the light day, And the darkness he called night. Evening came, and morning came, the first day. God said,
Let there be a vault through the middle of the waters, to divide the waters in two.
And so it was. God made the vault, and it divided the waters under the vault from the waters above the vault. God called the vault heaven. Evening came, and morning came, the second day.
Okay, interesting. So, what we're seeing here with this vault business is something that I would call an echo of old flat earth cosmology. Because as we talked about in volume 1 of my series on the Revelation to John, by the time of the New Testament, it had been demonstrated in what we would call a scientific way that the earth was spherical. And they were only a few thousand miles off in terms of their estimation of the circumference of the earth. But still, in Revelation, if you recall, we still have John referring to angels standing at the corners of the earth. And even in the New Testament, we have images of Satan, for example, taking Jesus up to a high mountaintop so that they could look down on all the kingdoms of the world. And of course, that implies a flat-ish earth, at least. And so, with this vault business, we're seeing an echo of these older stories. We're, just like I said earlier, we're peeking through the window now, and the Torah, or the Pentateuch, was written down shortly before humans had this conclusive proof of a spherical earth. Just know that when these words were being actually written down on papyrus, human progress was rushing headlong toward discovering that the Earth was a sphere in just the next few hundred years. But we still have this incident where a vault was created. Now, what does this mean? Well, there was this idea that there was water above the sky, meaning what we saw as that baby blue glowing thing that's set over the earth that turns into this crystalline thing that shows the stars at night. We think of that thing as being an illusion, and what we're actually seeing is the endless distance of empty space away from the earth. But they saw the earth as a flat object that was covered over with a dome of a kind. And they didn't theorize as to what the dome was made of. They imagined it had to be much stronger than anything humans could build, because it had to hold an ocean up over their heads. So basically there was the earth, then there was the air/sky, where the clouds are, where the birds fly. And then over that was the vault, which was a solid object, meaning you couldn't pass through it. And then above the vault was actual water, an ocean. And then above that, or outside of that, is, I suppose, the real heaven where God is and all the mysteries are. But it must have been a strange feeling compared to us for them to look up to the sky and see that they were under this solid object. It's a very different way of looking at the sky. Now, when we say the sky's the limit, it's kind of a joke because in our mind, you can just keep going out there forever for billions and billions of miles. But in their day, not so much. The sky literally was the limit. And so this is a good example of the fact that we're looking at an older cosmology. We're looking at someone considering the process of creating the universe based on what they understood and what they saw in the world around them. And so modern people will tend to look at this story and say, aha, beginning of the universe. Okay, where's the Big Bang? Well, it clearly is not approaching the subject that way. In fact, Genesis means the beginning, but beginning of what? Does it say the universe? It just says heaven and earth. And to me, that refers to the stuff that humans see around them, meaning the ground under your feet and the sky over your head. It's not necessarily the entire universe, and especially not the cosmos, meaning what's outside the universe. The multiverse, in other words. And by the way, that's not crazy talk. There are papers that are being published now based on James Webb Telescope data talking about how we are now seeing evidence for objects that could be considered outside our universe or in another one. And we're also seeing evidence that what we call our universe might be inside a black hole. So, we may be just as clueless about the actual nature of the universe and the context of it as the Genesis authors were. We might be just as confused as they were about the nature of the universe and where it came from and were they alone. And so I think it's a mistake to try to assign an exact date to this first day. We might be starting 4.4 billion years ago, which was the formation of the Earth. Or we might be starting 13 billion years ago, which was one of the dates approximately for the Big Bang, or the collapse of the black hole that we're inside of, if you are following the current science. But there is what's being called a crisis in cosmology. And the crisis of cosmology is that different methods are now producing different ages for the observable universe. And some of the ages are well beyond 13 billion years old. Now, it's clear that Genesis is not trying to do science. I do find it interesting that the author is supposing that creation occurred in stages, in discrete steps, not all at once. But let's not get too impressed by this modern approach. I mean, he may not have had everything poof into existence simultaneously by magic, but clearly we're not matching what we know about biology or geology at this point. And I'm not nitpicking either. One good example would be to point out that Genesis is saying that there was an earth and an ocean even before the sun was created. God created light without creating stars or the sun. They were talking about the actual substance of light, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And that is a clue that we're not talking about just the physical universe, but there is something that we have to talk about that came almost before everything else, and that is light. God sought to create light first, and that's strange for a lot of reasons. So God creates light just by saying, "Let there be light," meaning just through a conscious decision by expressing an idea. And we're going to see this a lot, that God is very interested in distinctions. And it almost seems that God creates by making distinctions. It's like matter and energy are just sort of there, and God creates by making one part of it not like the other part, by drawing distinctions. I think it's fascinating that God has to separate light from darkness before there's a sun and a moon. This binary principle seems to be fundamental to creation, in the view of the authors of Genesis. We have light and dark, land and sea, heaven and earth, the primordial world, the uncreated universe, is all one big blob. It lacks any distinction. It was chaos that had to be tamed and culled and subdivided. Genesis is implying here that God couldn't do anything really cool or impressive until he created perception and the ability to distinguish between light and dark. And note that I don't think they mean evil. Not yet. There may be evil in the cosmos at this point, but not in God's creation, not on earth, not yet. So this light business is really about logic and distinction and perception. And it's clearly important because the authors make it the first thing God does after this primordial earth is formed. And so Genesis is taking note of all the binary propositions that we find in the universe. And it seems to think that those are fundamental. In other words, we can't move on unless you can accept that some questions have yes or no answers, do or do not. Some things are true, and some things are not true. This whole shades of truth thing is going to cause a big problem later in Genesis, as we'll see. But originally, God intended a very plain, clockwork kind of universe. And the invention of light and the distinction between light and dark and the perception that that allows is something fundamental to creation, according to the authors of Genesis. Now, here's something that just rattles around in my head. It's a little hypothesis that I have, an ugly generalization that I've been keeping to myself. What is it, you ask? Well, here goes. Remember that I said that Genesis was different from Revelation because Genesis was written by people in authority, people who have power. Now, they had cultural power over Judaism. As far as political or military power, not so much. However, they were a group of people who had survived a near extinction event, and they had found strength and comfort in their identity and their distinction from other people. There's that word again. And I'm starting to think that distinctions, exclusions, binary propositions are tools of power. They are what people in power do. It's how they think. And the kind of free-form complexity that we see in the revelation to John implies a lack of power, a kind of desperation. But here in Genesis, the universe is very clear. It makes sense. Now, why do people in power tend to gravitate toward this? I think it's because there's this thing that we all have to do, and it involves a lot of unpleasant stuff, and we don't like to talk about it. But here goes, since I'm being super honest. Everybody has to do this thing all day where they look at something or a person and they generalize about it. They categorize it, often unfairly. They label it. And then they make distinctions. Then they make assumptions about this thing based on those unfair labels and those crude categories. Now, what is this thing I'm doing? It's called thinking. Unfortunately, human thought always involves making distinctions, exclusionary groups, categorizing things, often imperfectly, making generalizations and assumptions about something based on its category. And if you don't do that, then you can't think, you can't lead, you can't be creative. So in other words, you can't be effective without drawing distinctions. You can't lead people without being mean, basically. Because the minute you form a social group, for example, you're excluding people. By definition, if you say, okay, I'm forming Group A, and Group A contains people who, and then you have to have some sort of reason to exclude everyone else. Otherwise, you didn't create a group, you're just a mob, or a blob of anybody's, or all of humanity. But that's a species. That's not a social group. So you have to be able to be something or do something or have something that other people can't. Steve Jobs, who definitely should not be anyone's role model in terms of moral thinking or their personal life, but in terms of leading a business venture, in terms of entrepreneurial thinking, I think Steve Jobs is a good model. He once said that setting priorities is all about saying no. That if you can't say no, then you can't be a leader. If you can't say no to something interesting and exciting, then you can't set priorities. And that seems to be related to the thinking of the authors of Genesis here. They're seeing God as that kind of leader who makes distinctions and sets priorities and says yes to this and no to that. So let's listen to what happens next.
God said,
Let the waters under heaven come together into a single mass. And let dry land appear.
and so it was. God called the dry land earth, and the mass of the waters seas. And God saw that it was good. God said,
Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and fruit trees on earth. Bearing fruit with their seed inside, each corresponding to its own species.
And so it was. The earth produced vegetation, the various kinds of seed-bearing plants, and the fruit trees with seed inside, each corresponding to its own species. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and morning came, the third day. God said,
Let there be lights in the vault of heaven to divide day from night, and let them indicate festivals, days, and years. Let them be lights in the vault of heaven to shine on the earth.
And so it was. God made the two great lights. The greater light to govern the day, and the smaller light to govern the night, and the stars. God set them in the vault of heaven to shine on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to divide light from darkness. God saw that it was good. Evening came, and morning came, the fourth day.
Okay, well, that was interesting. So God has created plants. I think that people come to Genesis the wrong way. They're wanting to see a construction story. They want to know about the first algae and multicellular organisms and when did humans first stand upright. But instead, we have a being creating the vault and then causing the earth to sprout a bunch of plants, edible plants, and in particular, fruit trees. Now, this is clearly a huge break with biology. As far as we can tell, the first green things on Earth would have been algae in tide pools or in the ocean. And that would have occurred about 4 billion years ago. By 4 billion years ago, we see fossil evidence of life all over the Earth. Not complex life, but definitely life. Now, the first plants on land didn't arrive till about 500 million years ago. So from 4 billion, when the first life shows up, to 400 million, which is when the first green plants start growing on land, that's a long time. What's an even longer time is the distance between when the first green plants grow on land and when the first flowering plants or the first fruit trees appear. Now, that date has been a little contentious. There was a time when scientists assumed that Tyrannosaurus rex never saw a flower, that flowering plants didn't come around until right after the age of the dinosaurs. In other words, there was this idea that flowering plants, fruit and flowers, didn't evolve until the period between us and the dinosaurs' extinction. Now, recent fossil discoveries have extended that. And so, yes, dinosaurs did see flowers. They weren't as cool as the ones we have now, but it looks like flowering plants may go back to about 140 million years. Now, 140 million years is still a big gap. It's still a long time after 400 million years. And so, what's my point here? Well, I would say the authors of Genesis didn't know that, and what's more, they didn't care. Because I imagine even someone skilled in agriculture in the time period that Genesis was written down, even around 500 BC, they could have pulled in an expert who would have told them that all this free fruit without any insects or scavengers would eventually cause a problem. But note that Genesis is telling us that God put the fruit here first. In Genesis, God puts provisioning on the earth before he puts any animals that could eat it. He put useful vegetation all over the earth with no predators. And so, what is this saying? I think the point here is that the authors of Genesis are telling us that God sought to provide first and foremost. That God's first instinct was to put something useful and nourishing on the earth before he even considered what to put on the earth to eat it. He didn't intend for anything to ever go hungry or to do without. Everything was provided for in God's vision of the earth, according to Genesis. And we're going to see a lot more of this theme all through the book. And here's where my issue with Genesis really lies. I'm not buying it. I think that the universe we see around us now has certainly been made far worse by human behavior, but there are some fundamental things about the universe that aren't pleasant, but are not our fault. For example, as far as what we can tell about our own history and biology, humans are predators. Humans are hunters. Until the modern period, we could not grow into healthy adults without killing other animals. Now, with modern technology, we can live just fine without killing anything, but not 10,000 years ago. You were not going to raise a family in Central Asia 10,000 years ago without killing any animals. And a lot of human behavior is centered around hunting large animals in groups. And so there's an interesting idealized agricultural fantasy going on here about what the universe should have been like. And I can't help but wonder if this is getting at a distinction that humans at the time this was being written down were very concerned about. And that is the distinction between the pastoral, horse-bound, barbarian way of life, which involved a lot of hunting, or the agrarian, settled way of life that involved domestication of animals, but no hunting, and a much, much heavier reliance on plant material. There is one particular creature that he's going to create in our next volume on Genesis, and spoiler alert, one of his creations causes a problem. Things go off the rails. All the organisms on Earth were apparently supposed to be either autotrophs, meaning they made their own food from sunlight, or they ate plants. It was a vegetarian world. And that's fascinating because it's strange. It's a strange story. And I think it's hard for us to perceive how strange the story is because we've all heard it our whole lives. I'm sure most of my listeners haven't done a recent deep dive into Genesis, but I also assume that most of you already knew the basics of the creation story, and you weren't shocked by anything that you just heard. But as children, we generally weren't allowed to wonder out loud about how strange the story is. We have a supreme being that can do anything it wants just by thinking. And the first thing they wish into existence is electromagnetic radiation, also known as light. And then this being perceived that the existence of electromagnetic radiation is good. He made a moral judgment about a material phenomenon. Note that one of the first things that God does in the Bible is to render a moral judgment about a material phenomenon. Light. Light is good, in his estimation. God could have made anything first. He could have said, "Let there be love," or "Let there be gold," or "Let there be life." But he didn't. He wanted light. And if we look at Genesis as a story of God provisioning the world for what we needed, a story about God making a world that he intended to be good and bountiful and not hostile, what does light do for humans? What does it provide for us? Well, it's our primary sense. Light is how we absorb information about the world. Light is perception, or at the very least, for humans, light is necessary for perception. And so God saw that perception was good, and that shouldn't escape us. The drawing distinctions, the moral declarations, the provisioning, and in particular, the idea that God wanted to provision our senses or our minds first before provisioning our bodies. In other words, the creation of light so that people could see the universe around them and make judgments about it was essential. That was step one, not step two. And I think that's interesting. Now, what does that say about God? I don't know. But it definitely says a lot about the authors of Genesis and how they viewed God. And how are they viewing God? Well, as we covered, a being that is a leader that draws distinctions, but also God seems to be searching for the solution to some kind of problem. He's building all of this for a reason that's not entirely clear. Well, you can't say that it's completely unclear. The Bible is fairly clear about God's goal, about what God is seeking while he's creating the universe. It's not a mystery. It's right there in the text, over and over again. Goodness. God was after goodness. God saw that light was good, so he made more stuff that was good. So, the goal of creation is goodness. That's the straight edge, the plumb line. I also think it's interesting that God existed before light, but in the universe, God is represented as light, often, in the Bible in particular. We all associate light with power, or with the sun, or the light that's produced by fire. When God shows himself to Moses, he appears as a bright light. And then a column of fire leads the Israelites in the Exodus story. Then we have angels like Lucifer, a Latin word that means the light bearer or the light bringer. So light is not just God. God existed before light. But light is heavily associated with the entire class of being that is above us. All of the kinds of beings that outrank us. In other words, the fully immaterial. And so, light represents the power of perception, like I said before, the ability to see the material world and judge it. But it also represents the intrusion of the immaterial into the material. And this is all part of the fundamental meaning of the creation story in Genesis. Essentially, what's being said here is that an immaterial being, a disembodied mind, caused the observable universe to exist. And that being did it because he saw that it was a good thing to do. And so creation and morality are fused from the beginning. And so God's intent is the highest good. Now, this is all a big edifice of circular reasoning that goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle had a definition of good, which I think is a pretty good one. It's a very descriptive and functional definition, but I'm not sure how useful it is because, like I said, it's pretty circular. Aristotle says that the good is that to which all actions aim. That is very, very Aristotle. Peak Aristotle. In other words, the endpoint of every intention is goodness. Now, that sounds strange because we're all familiar with the idea of evil intent. But Aristotle would say that If Ted Bundy's intent is to bash someone's head in with a wrench, then that is goodness to Ted Bundy in that moment. When a mosquito bites you, its nervous system is having it carry out a series of actions that achieves something that is good from its point of view. It needs to feed its future children. So for Aristotle, good is simply what every mind tries to do. Every mind has to define goodness because it has to decide what to do next. Otherwise, it's not really a functional mind. Well, that's where we'll leave it for today. In our next volume on Genesis, we'll continue with the story of the first 7 days of creation. And as promised, we'll go back through them and hopefully we'll be able to sort of separate out all of the modern noise of looking for clues to 5th century BC biological knowledge or geological knowledge. This is not about physics or astronomy. This is about establishing the idea that God's intent in creating the universe was originally good, that God did not intend for death or suffering or famine to occur. So what goes wrong? I guess we'll have to find out next time. I get the feeling that maybe at some point during these 7 days, God creates something that maybe he shouldn't have. God creates a being that causes more trouble than they're worth. That's just my prediction. I don't know what species that will be, or what form this troublemaker will take. But I just have a feeling that it's coming, because there's got to be a scapegoat, right? I don't know. But we'll find out next time. Don't read the Bible before then to read ahead. Don't spoil it. Let's all discover this together. Next time we'll find out what made the universe go off the rails. Who's the problem around here? It's definitely not me. Is it you? All right. Well, we'll find out next time. And until then, talk to you later.